Hello everybody, my name is Divya Ramesh and today I'll be talking about a snake robot to study force generation and control of limbless locomotion in 3D terrain. Snakes can move very well in various complex 3D terrains by bending their body in 3 dimensions to generate the right propulsive forces to help them traverse successfully. Previous studies have found that snakes laterally bend their body to push against the vertical structures to generate propulsive forces to help them move forward. They may use feedback using terrain contact force sensing to help maintain contact and control the direction of propulsion. Snake robots have been successful in achieving this. Sensory feedback via terrain contact sensing has helped the snake robots achieve 2D lateral bending over such terrain, which further suggests that snake's propulsion generation via lateral bending is a sensory modulated process. A recent study of snake traversal over ladder-like obstacles showed that snakes use vertical bending to push against the obstacles to generate large propulsive forces. They found that the 4F force is much larger than that of the lateral force to generate propulsion to help them move forward. This leads to the question as to how generally snakes traverse 3D structures. Our hypothesis is that snakes combine both lateral and vertical bending to help them move over a 3D terrain. Another student from our lab studied generalist snakes moving over a terrain filled with blocks of varying heights. It was found that snakes use vertical bending to potentially propel against complex 3D terrain. A high accuracy method was used to reconstruct the body to get how it contacts with the terrain. Here is an example of the reconstructed body surface reprojected back to the camera view and a flattened sagittal view with reconstructed body and terrain surfaces. It was found that snakes likely use multiple body obstacle contact push points to generate propulsive forces. Those potential push points that may have helped in forward propulsion were counted. Here, the blue arrows correspond to those push points on the higher blocks, and the red ones correspond to those push points over the horizontal block edges. These are points that may generate forward propulsion. This suggests that snakes use both lateral and vertical bending to increase the number of push points, and they likely use sensory feedback to control body bending to push against the terrain in 3D to generate contact forces along the desired direction. Earlier studies have found that snake skin has multiple mechanoreceptors. 3 different mechanoreceptors, such as rapidly adapting, slowly adapting, and intermediate between the two receptors, are found along the entire snake skin. And these receptors are also known to be sensitive to different mechanical stimuli, such as rapidly adapting receptors being sensitive to a needle scraping over the scales, or the slowly adapting receptors being sensitive to a steady force applied to the skin. This suggests that snakes are capable of using tactile sensing. We know very little about how tactile sensing may be used by snakes to detect and use the terrain contact forces as feedback in aiding locomotion on 3D terrains. Robots can be used as physical models to help understand the principles behind the use of tactile sensing in snakes. Compared to animals, robots can also be used in performing systematic and controlled experiments and help obtain repeatable results. We can use a sensorized robot to study and help understand the principles behind how body deforms in response to terrain contact to generate the right forces. Such an understanding can also help the snake robots to perform well in multiple applications where the terrain is unknown and filled with multiple obstacles such as search and rescue, exploration, and inspection. Many current robots, despite using methods like vision or camera to scan the environment to plan motion using terrain geometry, passive mechanical compliance, and control compliance that make the robots to try to maintain contact with the terrain, make the robots to move very slowly or slip a lot. None of these have deliberately used vertical bending to generate propulsion. Instead, they are all for bridging height differences. Principles of sensory feedback from studying a robophysical model will help understand how these contact forces are exerted or redirected and find better strategies to help the robots to traverse such terrains similar to that of the snakes. For our study, we chose a low-cost, flexible, piezoresistive sensor which consists of a piezoresistive film that is sandwiched between copper sheets on either side of the film. Each copper sheet is then covered by an adhesive and a stretchable LDPE film to protect the sensor. The normal force when applied on the sensor compresses the soft piezoresistive film, causing a decrease in its resistance, which is nothing but an increase in its conductance. We then applied different known normal forces and recorded the conductance in response to these forces. This sensor conductance is found to be linear to the force applied. Using the linear relationship, we can find the fitting parameters M and B. Here is an example of a 4x4 sensor where on application of an unknown force on one of the sensors, we were able to estimate the forces successfully using the fitting parameters. Our robot SenSnake weighs 2.4 kgs and is 0.96 meters long. This robot is designed to have all of the sensor and motor wiring run along the inside of the enclosed shells of all of the segments to prevent them from getting stuck over the obstacles during locomotion. This 12-segment robot has alternating yaw and pitch segments where each yaw segment can be moved in the lateral plane and each pitch segment can be moved on the vertical plane. Each segment consists of a motor that is enclosed between a rigid shell on the top and a compliant shell on the sides and the bottom. This compliant shell can conform to large terrain asperities to better generate and sense forces. 3 sensors are used to cover the entire outer surface of the compliant shell. 3 sensors per segment totals about 36 sensors for all the 12 segments of the robot, and these 36 sensors can be scanned at 30 Hz. A rubber is added to each sensor to prevent the sensors from wear and tear. We then added a sleeve onto the robot, which helps reduce friction during our experiments. This sleeve also helps to avoid the shape edges being caught by the terrain asperities. As a first step, to test if the robot can use vertical bending to generate propulsion to move forward and how well the sensors measure terrain reaction forces, we tested the robot on a half cylindrical obstacle which is made up of laser cut wooden sheets. We used plastic sheet and covered it over the entire setup to reduce friction. Then added cameras around the entire setup, which helps track rigid bodies with the help of LED markers. LED markers were placed on each segment of the robot with the help of a marker holder. This would allow us to track each segment of the robot during our experiments. As a first proof of concept, we showed that the force sensor works during feed-forward motion, which is pre-planned and has no sensory feedback. We used a feed-forward control to propagate a predefined vertical bending shape down the body from head to tail. This predefined shape was generated by manually pushing the robot down to conform to the obstacle, and we recorded the motor angles at the start of each experiment. The robot was started with the 6th segment on top of the middle of the obstacle because on a flat ground, a vertical bending could not generate sufficient propulsion to help it move forward. We used the tracking and the force data to get a visualization of our experiments. We used the measured forces from all of the middle sensors of all the segments of the robot to get a spatiotemporal color map that allows us to see how the forces vary with respect to time. We note here that the 10th middle sensor on the 10th segment does not give accurate measured force due to a bad sensor connection. As the robot moved forward, all the contact forces patterns propagated backward relative to the robot. The segment pushing onto the obstacle with the normal force projected forward passes down the robot body over time. For the first 10 seconds, the robot's forward motion was smooth, with substantial normal forces from the segment contact with the front of the obstacle, which helped generate forward propulsion. Once the middle of the robot moved over the middle of the obstacle, the robot stopped moving forward and generated a large force from pushing on the obstacle and eventually slip forward before resuming to move smoothly. We compared the forward position of all the segments of the robot from the tracking data and also the force data of all of the segments between 3 trials. And we found that there is a high repeatability in both the data. This repeatability will help us in systematic experiments to understand the physics principles behind snake locomotion. One complexity I haven't talked about these sensors is that when force is applied, the soft piezoresistive material takes some time to respond, which results in a slow increase in conductance to approach a maximal value. This characteristic time of discrete behavior is large and can be comparable to the timescale of locomotion. This can be a challenge to dynamic force measurement. We designed a calibration setup that helps us get repeatable sensor response under different constant loads and apply it onto the sensor, and we were able to use a 3-parameter model to capture discrete behavior. This will help obtain accurate dynamic force estimation from the sensor reading for an accurate sensory feedback. With the creep characterization and model using variable constant force, we can then apply the supervision principle to split the dynamic forces into smaller parts to obtain dynamic force measurement during locomotion. When a variable force is applied, for example here, first a lower constant and then a higher constant force, the response can be split into 2 parts. Hence, any dynamic force can thus be decomposed into these small steps similarly to apply the model. As our next step, we plan to use force as feedback to help the robot body to bend during the obstacle-robot interaction to generate the propulsive forces. Another talk by my colleague gives a detail of the different feedback methods that can be used to achieve this. We then plan to perform systematic experiments to help understand the principles of the sensory feedback to control propulsion. We then aim to explore more complex terrains in the near future. With this, I'd like to thank all of the lab members in various aspects of the project, and I'd also like to thank the funding sources. Thank you.